Welcome to our New Orleans episode of America's Dark Places, a series where I branch out from our typical overviews of a state's weird folklore and take a more focused look at the urban legends and horrifying stories concentrated in a particular place. Today, as I said, we're covering New Orleans, a place with a heck of a history. From women with sharp teeth that dwell in the attic of the French Quarter's Ursuline Convent, to voodoo queens, to a man that went house to house, taking out his adversaries with their own axes. It seems that nothing is safe in this town. And today, we're going to talk about some of the strangest or darkest stories in it. Also, quick reminder, if you like what you see, your subscription, a like, and a comment will go a long way towards saying, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. With that, let me hit you with a warm howdy doody before you come with me. Let's explore this dark place. Today, we're kicking it off where my own spooky tour of New Orleans began, the legendary Ursuline Convent. And our first tale is the deeply unsettling little vampire story that's been floating around the French Quarter since the early 1700s, the legend of the Casquette girls. Now, to set the scene, let's talk about New Orleans in the early 18th century. It was basically the original frat house of America. This French-controlled territory was populated almost entirely by men, soldiers, fur traders, miners, and criminals. Yes, literally criminals. France was sending their convicts over here like, are you stabbing people? Well, that's great. Try doing it in this swamp. And the only women around were Native American, and while the local men were very interested in the native tribes, they were not very interested back. So as you can imagine, things were getting a little awkward. Enter 15-year-old King Louis XV, who clearly wanted to play colonial Cupid. His idea was to send a boatload of French women to the colonies to civilize the men, and turn these bachelor buffoons into respectable family men. Also, babies. The colony needed babies, a stable, thriving, baby-making populace. That was the dream. So in 1728, a ship full of women made their way to New Orleans, but when they arrived, well, they weren't exactly giving off blushing bride energy. They were pale. Like, this boat hasn't seen daylight since France pale. Some looked downright sick, and they were carrying these small, kind of coffin-shaped wooden trunks referred to at the time as casquettes. Oh, and allegedly, a few of them had blood on their mouths, so, a really great first impression. The story goes that these women were taken in by the Ursuline nuns and housed on the third floor of the convent, which, fun fact, was where they and their mysterious luggage were kept under lock and key. And then, people started going missing. Now, going missing in early New Orleans wasn't exactly headline news. Life expectancy bad then was bad, like don't plan long-term bad. But these passings were weird. Those that disappeared were later found drained of blood, like completely, which is not typical, and supposedly this kicked off a full-on vampire panic. The nuns, being women of the cloth, but also fully susceptible to centuries-old European superstition, decided to take action. They went to inspect the trunks that were supposed to stay closed until the women were married, and they found them empty, which meant either someone had stolen their dowries or these ladies never intended to marry in the first place. Suspicious. In a panic, the nuns nailed the third-floor shutters closed, using nails blessed by the Pope. Yes, the Pope. Just in case you thought this vampire panic was a casual affair. They blessed the entire building and prayed the sun would take care of any undead nonsense that tried to get back in before sunrise. And then, nothing. The so-called Casquette girls were never seen again. Now, maybe the sun did do them in, maybe they flew away, or maybe, and this is the one that keeps the ghost tours in business, they're still out there, hiding in plain sight. The original source of New Orleans' legendary vampiric lore. Now, look, I get it, this story might sound bananas, but the legends don't actually stop here. There's a popular story from the late 1900s, for instance, involving a pair of reporters. These two geniuses decided to camp outside of the convent overnight to see if the third-floor shutters ever opened, since, allegedly, people had reported seeing lights inside and even figures moving around. So, as reporters in the 90s do, they parked their Crown Victoria, they settled in, and they waited outside of the Ursuline Convent. And around 1 or 2 a.m., it said that the two vigilant reporters would end up falling asleep. That's journalistic excellence if you ask me. The next morning, they were still there. They were parked, their doors were locked, and instead of actually just being asleep, it said that some bystanders found them torn to pieces inside of the car. Apparently, whatever was watching them from inside the convent didn't appreciate being watched and made it inside of their car and took care of them. And then you've got some other vampire stories that feel ripped straight out of Interview with the Vampire, like the woman who said she lost her friend at Lafitte's Blacksmith shop bar, already a spooky place, and found her following a pale, handsome man down Dauphine Street. When they entered the park at Dauphine and Barracks, the man leaned in like he was about to kiss her, but opened his mouth and revealed fangs. The friend, who was stalking them, of course, screamed, and the man didn't run. He, according to the friend, flew into the air in a flash of black and disappeared, never to be seen again. Now, frankly, I just thought this was normal behavior in the French Quarter, but what do I know? Also, there's a story of a bartender from New York who moved to New Orleans for a slower life and said he saw a child with jet black eyes standing on his bar late at night. The kid started rummaging through glasses like a tiny goth raccoon, and eventually, once the child caught wind of him, chased the guy outside. He slammed the door behind him, but the kid didn't follow, and it just kind of stood there watching before it disappeared. Maybe this is some connection to the black-eyed children, who knows? And then there's my favorite, a urban legend claiming that after Hurricane Katrina, police and military escorted mysterious individuals from a private jet at the New Orleans airport straight to the Ursuline Convent. Apparently some civilians saw this and got curious, and they did some digging and they found that a plane from the freaking Vatican had landed earlier that day. So the implication was that even in the middle of post-Katrina chaos, the Pope, the literal Pope, sent people to make sure whatever might have been locked up in that convent was still locked up, because apparently that was a priority not just for the Catholic Church, but also for the US military. So anyways, that's the legend of the Casquette Girls. And I love the legend. I think it's good fun, but what's the real story? So let's go back to King Louis and start with that. King Louis really did ship women to New Orleans to quote-unquote help the colony. He'd done this before in Quebec, where it actually did work, and he sent women to Mobile, Alabama before New Orleans too, who were less thrilled with their assignment, let's say. Now don't get me wrong, I'd personally love to live in New Orleans, but I think the idea of a malaria-filled swamp, especially back in the day when there was no air conditioning, was a little worse than Quebec. The Casquette Girls, too, were in fact very real. They were actually from l'Hôpital Royal de la Salpêtrière in Paris, a place that called itself a hospital but was really more of a catch-all prison for women who were mentally ill, accused of witchcraft, criminal, poor, or just Protestant. Basically, anybody that was weird and a woman by 1700 standards. When these girls, ages 14 to 17, were sent to New Orleans, they were given a trunk with some clothes and basic supplies. These caskets were just luggage, not coffins. But regardless, the word casket was used. This is an etymology problem. And as for the whole they were pale and had blood on their mouths thing, well, imagine living under the deck of a ship for 2 months with barely any light, zero personal space, and what was likely a diet of bugs and regret. Tuberculosis was rampant and causes you guessed it, to cough up blood. So yeah, they showed up looking like extras from a Dracula reboot. Now, here's where the facts and the legends blur. When the girls first arrived, the Ursuline Convent hadn't even been built yet. The first version was actually erected in 1734, 6 years after the girls landed, and it promptly actually started sinking into a swamp. The version you see today was completed in 1752, and at that point, the nuns and the unmarried Casquette Girls did relocate there. There was a grand procession, and at the very back, some very long boxes. Maybe, likely honestly, just more trunks. But some say they were coffins. I'll let you decide. It's always nice to have a few loose ends that keep the mystery alive. So yes, the third floor shutters today, they really are nailed shut. And yes, nobody really seems to know why. Some say it's just to keep the building cool and preserve the woodwork, but others say that something is still up there. And yeah, also there's allegedly a room full of chains on that floor, which sounds super ominous until you realize the convent also served as a kind of hospital, and sometimes it housed people who were mentally unwell, some of whom reportedly needed restraints. So is the Ursuline convent haunted by the original vampire immigrants of New Orleans, or is it just a place where sick, mistreated girls were misunderstood, and maybe deliberately made into monsters by stories people told about them? Personally, I don't know, I wasn't there, but if you go visit the convent today, maybe don't stare too long at that third floor. You never know who or what might be staring back. If you've ever stumbled down the corner of Bourbon and St. Philip and stumbled upon an old candlelit establishment that made you think, wow, this place looks like it's been haunted since before air conditioning was invented, well, congratulations, you've found Lafitte's Blacksmith Shop Bar. This place is among the oldest buildings in the French Quarter, constructed somewhere between 1722 and 1732, and this place has seen some stuff. It's named after the infamous Lafitte brothers, Jean and Pierre, smugglers, privateers, and all-around 19th century bad boys who allegedly used this exact building as their base of operations from 1772 to 1791. They ran their little pirate side hustle here, probably while arguing over who had the better mustache. Jean Lafitte eventually became a local legend, of course, after helping Andrew Jackson win the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. We'll talk about this later. But here's where the fun starts. While Jean passed away off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, apparently his ghost missed the ambiance of the candlelight and rum, because according to modern-day patrons, he still shows up here now and again as a full-bodied apparition. People claim they hear the floorboards creaking when he's around, and suddenly, nearby they'll see a man that looks exceptionally out of place, if a bit unkempt. It's said that his favorite haunt is in the shadows of the fireplace that dwell in the center of the establishment, sort of like some kind of spectral brooding influencer hogging the best spot in the building. Now, speaking of spirits, literal and otherwise, I had one of their grape daiquiris, and I'm not exaggerating when I say it nearly sent me to the spirit realm. Delicious, yes. Dangerous, absolutely, which might explain why so many people nap dramatically on the sidewalk outside, or perhaps why they see ghosts in this establishment in the first place. Regardless, if you happen to see a ghost here, it's either Jean or you just finished 2 drinks and they're playing a trick on you. As the story goes, Jean isn't the only spectral resident, though. In the 1800s, it's also noted that an unnamed woman lived in the upstairs apartment, and sadly she took her own life. Guests say that she still appears in this bar because of that. But she's not your average ghost. No moaning in the hallway for her. No, she's flirty, she's chatty, and allegedly has no problem hyping up guests before pulling a classic ghost move, vanishing into thin air. Honestly though, T's Storytime is more than happy to support a ghostly girl with some confidence. I'm into it. Oh, and if you've ever been inside, you'll know this place is dark. Like, I can't see my own drink dark. At least when it's not too rowdy outside. It's lit only by candles, lanterns, and the flickering fireplace in the middle of the bar. So if you're chilling in a corner and suddenly feel like someone's staring at you from the shadows, you're not alone. People report seeing piercing eyes watching them from the darkness. Sometimes they fade away, sometimes they linger. Either way, it's not the kind of eye contact you want while trying to enjoy your overpriced cocktail. In short, this is the kind of place where you can have a drink with a ghost, drink something that might put you in the ground, and lock eyes with something unholy across the bar. Good luck out there, and maybe bring a flashlight if you're not one for dark, cramped spaces. Actually, don't. It would ruin the ambiance, but you get my drift. Okay, now we move on to another bar, and imagine this. You're sitting in a cozy, candlelit restaurant, the warm aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through the air, the clink of glasses and chatter of diners, and the soft hum of jazz create a perfect evening, until suddenly, a glass shatters across the room. A chair moves on its own, and you notice something strange about the wine glass that's always been filled with a little more than others. If we're talking about dining with the dead, how could we not talk about Muriel's? The famous restaurant in the heart of New Orleans that not only serves up delicious Creole dishes, but it also offers a side of hauntings, history, and a dash of good old-fashioned ghostly mystery. So let's pull up a chair and dive into the tale of Muriel's, where the food is good, but the company, well, that's a different story. Before we meet the spirits who haunt Muriel's today, let's set the stage with a little history. The story begins long before the restaurant's doors opened back in 2001. Back in the 1700s, during the founding of New Orleans, a young French-Canadian man named Claude Trepanier was given a piece of land that Muriel's now occupies as part of his payment for services rendered in the expedition that established the city. He built a cottage on the land. Around this time, the area was called Place d'Armes, and it was actually not exactly charming. It was historically sort of like New Orleans' gallows, and I say sort of, but it just was the gallows. Interesting place to set up a cottage. Fast forward to the mid-1700s, though, and this piece of land went from being gallows and a cottage to an extravagant mansion, built by none other than the royal treasurer of the French Louisiana colonies. After his passing, the mansion changed hands a few times, including a period when Pierre-Philippe de Marny used it as his home when he was in town from his plantation. But things got explosive in 1788. The Great Fire of New Orleans, one of the most infamous fires in the city's and the nation's history, consumed much of the French Quarter, including the mansion on this very spot. A few decades later, the Spanish rebuilt the area, restoring and rebuilding many of the iconic buildings we see today, including St. Louis Cathedral. By 1814, a wealthy merchant named Pierre-Antoine Lepardie Jourdan decided to build his dream home on the spot where the old mansion and the cottage once stood. And he loved this mansion. I'm talking loved, almost lusted after the thing. But here's where the story takes a turn for the tragic. Jourdan, despite his wealth, had a little problem. He was a really bad gambler, and in a stroke of bad luck, or really just sheer recklessness, he bet his beloved home in a poker game, and naturally he lost. Devastated by his loss, and perhaps overwhelmed by a deep sense of shame, Jourdan took his own life in the beloved home. He chose the second floor as his resting place, specifically where Muriel's Seance Lounge sits today. This, according to some, is where his ghost still lingers. Now, if you think Muriel's ghostly guest is going to appear as a full-bodied apparition, think again. Pierre Jourdan's spirit is said to manifest as a sparkling light, often seen moving across the second-floor lounge where he supposedly still roams, a lost soul trying to find peace. But if you're not in this lounge, don't get too comfortable. His presence isn't the only paranormal activity supposedly happening at Muriel's. Locals and diners alike have reported seeing objects moving on their own, including chairs scraping across the floor and glasses mysteriously falling to the ground. And it's not just the upper floor where strange things happen. The Courtyard Bar, a lovely space with an old-world charm, has its own set of spooky occurrences. It's here that glasses have been seen flying off of the bar, slamming into the brick wall across the room. Could these be the disgruntled spirits of former patrons or possibly former servants? Whatever it is, theories are abound. Also, if you're lucky or perhaps unlucky enough to visit the courtyard, you may encounter another of Muriel's ghostly residents, the woman in white. The mysterious figure, always clad in a flowing white dress, glides silently across the courtyard or stands motionless, staring at the fountain. You might catch a glimpse of her from the corner of your eye, only to find she vanishes when you look directly at her. But it's not just fleeting apparitions and mysterious lights. Paranormal investigators who've visited Muriel's report frequent EMF spikes, shadowy figures darting through the corners of rooms, and strange knocks on the brick walls. Some believe these knocks are attempts at communication from the spirits trapped here, as is the voice of a woman often heard in the courtyard that many think is the woman in white. And while we're all a little skeptical about EMF readings, are they reliable, or are they just the digital equivalent of a creaky floorboard, it's hard to deny the eerie atmosphere of the place. But what's most intriguing, at least to me, about Muriel's is its tradition of honoring the ghosts that linger here. In the front window, there's a table that's always set for one, always with bread and wine left there for their old guest, Pierre-Antoine Lepardie Jourdan. It's a strange and slightly macabre gesture, but it speaks to the restaurant's deep connection to its haunted past. Whether Jourdan is aware of the table set in his honor or not, it's a nod to the place he once called home. So the next time you find yourself in New Orleans, consider stopping by Muriel's for a bite to eat. It may be the perfect setting for a ghost story, but it's also a place steeped in history with spirits who seem reluctant to leave. Alright, for this one, let me take you back to 1918 New Orleans, a city that's already full of spirits, secrets, and sultry jazz, but was about to get one more spirit. Except this guy broke into your house and chopped you up with your own axe. That's right, we're talking about the Axeman, a real-life boogeyman who roamed the Crescent City between 1918 and 1919, creeping into homes while folks were sleeping and unleashing absolute carnage. He didn't bring his own weapons. Oh no, this guy had the audacity to use whatever sharp object you had lying around. It was like being taken down by your own bad housekeeping. This whole saga kicked off at 4901 Magnolia Street. Catherine and Joseph Maggio, he was an Italian grocer, were attacked while they slept. Their throats were cut with a straight razor, and then they were whacked with an axe. Catherine's head was nearly separated from her. Joseph, though, lived only long enough to be found still moaning in agony. And who found them? It was actually Joseph's own brothers, Jake and Andrew, who lived in the same house. Andrew later said he heard moaning through the walls that night, but didn't think much of it, because he was drunk. Unfortunately, he blamed himself for the passings, and was even briefly considered the prime suspect, especially since razors used in the attack belonged to his barbershop on Camp Street. Oh, and here's a detail that gets glossed over a lot. On the sidewalk near the house, someone had scrawled a cryptic message in chalk. Miss Maggio will sit up tonight just like Miss Tony. It's thought by most this is a reference to a previous attack in 1912 when another Italian grocer couple, Anthony and Joanna Chiambra, were attacked. Seems our axe-wielding psycho had a long memory, and maybe a vendetta. So was this a robbery? Well, it doesn't seem so. Nothing was really stolen. But the bottom panel of the kitchen door had been knocked out, and an axe was found discarded nearby, along with some bloody clothing. About a month later, over at the corner of Dorgenois and La Harpe Streets, grocery store owner Louis Bessemer and his mistress Anna Lowe were attacked. A baker named John Zanka actually found them while making his morning deliveries, and despite being the guy who called for help, poor John got blamed for a hot second because apparently being on time was suspicious in early 1900s New Orleans. Bessemer survived with a skull fracture, and Lowe's face was left partially paralyzed, and she would pass away about 7 weeks later. They initially said the attacker was a large white man with a hatchet, and again, the door panel was missing in this instance. As for the weapon, of course, it was Bessemer's own axe. Now, in a side plot that belongs in its own soap opera, a former bakery employee named Louis Ubicon, a African-American man, was arrested despite pretty much zero evidence, just based on shaky alibis and that classic old 1918 racism. Thankfully, though, he was eventually released. As for Anna Lowe, she spent her final weeks stirring the pot. She made all kinds of wild accusations, eventually even blaming Bessemer, her partner, himself for the attack, and claiming he was a German spy. He actually got charged with this too, and would end up spending about 9 months in jail for it, only to be acquitted after a jury deliberated for 10 minutes on the topic. Next, on August 5th of 1918, Miss Ed Schneider was found injured in her home, but alive. Her husband came home late from work and found her battered. Also, as was tradition, their axe was missing from the shed. Despite her injuries, she would actually give birth a week later to a healthy baby girl. And at this point, New Orleans started to collectively freak out. And if you look towards old newspaper articles recounting this period in New Orleans, you'll find that armed men started to patrol their homes at night, and the police were on the hunt for this phantom known only as the Axeman. Now, 5 days after this event, 80-year-old Joseph Romano was attacked near Tonty and Gravier streets. His nieces found him still alive, but he passed away 2 days after the attacks. And as for the attacker, they actually saw him. They described him as a tall, heavy-set man wearing a dark suit and a black slouch hat. I mean, that's basically the Grim Reaper in Mardi Gras attire, isn't it? I guess with less bones, though. Then, a 7-month lull later, the Axeman struck again. This time, it was the Cordemelia family, Rose, Charles, and their young daughter. Charles and Rose survived, but tragically, their daughter did not. And here's where things get messy. After waking up in the hospital, Rose accused their neighbors, Frank Giordano and his son, of the attack. But the son, Frank Jr., was noted to have been too fat to fit through the busted door panel. What an unfortunate alibi. But yeah, that was literally his alibi. Sadly, though, not even body shaming would save his life, as despite her husband Charles denying Rose's claims, the Giordanos were convicted and sentenced to hang. Luckily, just a year later, before they would actually be hung, Rose admitted she made it all up out of spite and jealousy, getting them out of the slammer. But what the heck, Rose? Why would you do that to someone that wasn't even involved in the attack? Now, here's where this whole thing gets truly unhinged, and how the Axeman perhaps purposefully inspired one of the most magical nights in the history of New Orleans. On March 13th of 1919, the Times-Picayune received a letter from the Axeman himself. Here's a dramatic reading of the highlights, because it's frankly wild and it's really historic. In this letter, the Axeman would say, "I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as the most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I am going to pass over New Orleans. I swear by all the devils in the nether region that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing. If everyone has a jazz band going, well then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, and that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe." That's right, he threatened to take down everyone in the city unless they played jazz. He basically said, crank that phonograph or it's time to die. And people listened. That night, March 19th of 1919, New Orleans came alive. Jazz clubs were packed, homes were filled with music, and the city partied like their lives depended on it. No one was actually taken that night, so I guess the Axeman was a man of his word after all, if he was anything. This weird letter even inspired the creation of a jazz track called Don't Scare Me Papa, also known as the Axeman's Jazz. It's a bop, honestly. Following this night, however, those that laid down jazz were not necessarily safe. For instance, on August 10th of 1919, another Italian grocer, Steve Bocca, was attacked in his sleep and survived, but didn't remember much thanks to his head injury. Also, in early September, 19-year-old Sarah Lawman was attacked through an open window and survived, but couldn't recall details. Also, on October 27th of 1919, at the South Scott and Ulloa Street corner, Esther and Mike Pepitone were attacked. Esther would actually awake to her husband Mike being beaten, sustaining injuries he would pass away from. Esther, in this instance, actually reported seeing two individuals that, of course, she was unable to identify. And apparently a bolt with a heavy nut was identified as the weapon, which was linked to a surface on the nearby Tulane Avenue. This was actually the last of the alleged Axeman attacks from what I can tell. So with the attacks out of the way, let's talk suspects. Or I guess suspect, as there's only one major individual that keeps popping up, and his name is Joseph Mumfree, sometimes referred to as Joseph Monfree. He's especially interesting because of his connection to the very last Axeman attack, that of Mike Pepitone. Now, Mike's wife, Esther Pepitone, if we remember, survived that brutal 1919 attack. Not long after this, she would leave New Orleans behind, and actually would move to Los Angeles, where she eventually remarried to a man named Angelo Albino. But things didn't exactly settle down. Just 2 years later, Angelo would vanish without a trace. And here's where it gets wild. Angelo had previously been involved in some shady business dealings with a man named Joseph Mumfree, and on December 5th of 1921, Mumfree reportedly showed up at Esther's home in LA and threatened her, possibly trying to rob her, but Esther wasn't having it. In a moment of absolute badassery, she pulled out a revolver and just blasted him right on the spot, right there at 36th Street and 500 East. So it pretty much went like this. Joseph said, "If you don't do XYZ, I'm gonna off ya." And she said, "Oh yeah, well, what if I just shoot you?" And then did it. Pretty bad if you ask me. After this, Esther claimed that Mumfree was actually the Axeman of New Orleans. She said she'd seen him at the scene that night her first husband was taken. And here's the kicker, the LAPD actually admitted to finding evidence linking Mumphrey to Mike Pepitone's death. Also, it gets darker. Mumphrey had led a blackmail gang in New Orleans that specifically targeted, hear this, Italian immigrants. And wouldn't you know, Mumphrey's blackmail gang was tied to harassing and targeting Italian Americans. Something that's interesting given most of the cases involved in this case, as I noted, were Italian grocers. Also, he'd been in and out of prison over the years, and his time out of prison just so happens to line up very, very well with the Axemen attacks. So sure, you can say all of this is circumstantial, because honestly it is, but when you start connecting the dots, Joseph Mumphrey becomes a pretty interesting suspect. Anyways, we'll probably never know definitively who the Axeman really was. Maybe he was just a crazed attacker, but my money is on him being a mafioso. Regardless, this is the tale of how, for one weird year, New Orleans was terrorized by someone who hated sleep, loved jazz, and wanted you to jazz it out or die. And if that isn't the most New Orleans threat ever, I don't know what is. Delphine McCarty was born in 1787 to the prestigious McCarty family in New Orleans, a clan with roots in the French colonial period. Her ancestors were Irish, and in a cruel twist of fate, their own escape from religious persecution in Ireland would lead to them becoming part of the system that perpetuated the suffering of others in America, actively participating in the oh-so-common ownership of slaves. The McCartys were wealthy, with holdings in land, trade, and real estate, and like many other prominent families of the time, their wealth was built on the backs of enslaved people. As a child, Delphine was no stranger to privilege, but she also had an unusual start to life. Her baptismal record was notably missing from the parish registers until 5 years after her birth, a strange gap that led some historians to speculate that she was seriously ill at birth and nearly didn't survive. Whether that's true or just a historical footnote, one thing's for certain, Delphine was born into a life of affluence, and she would grow to wield it in ways that would shock New Orleans to its core. Now, fun fact, Delphine had 3 husbands, and her first notch on her matrimonial bingo card occurred when she was still very young, around 14 or 15, to a Spanish nobleman named Don Ramon de Lopez y Angoyo. Now, that is a name. He was a high-ranking officer in the Spanish army, and the two were married in the Grand St. Louis Cathedral of New Orleans. And at some point, they set off for Spain, where Delphine gave birth to a daughter. But their happiness was short-lived. Delphine's husband passed away in Havana while they were on their way to Madrid, leaving her a widow and a teen mom, which wasn't really out of the ordinary back then. This would be her first major loss, but not her last. Delphine returned to New Orleans and married again in 1808 to Jean Blanc, a well-off New Orleans merchant. Together, they had 4 children. However, by 1816, Jean died unexpectedly. 2 husbands, both gone too soon. Some say this series of tragedies, along with her increasing power and wealth, began to affect her, though that's purely speculative. But let's not kid ourselves, the next chapter in her life would turn the tide from bad to worse. Hence, in 1825, Delphine would marry again. This time, it was to Dr. Leonard Louis Nicolas LaLaurie, a French physician, who was maybe a chiropractor, depending on who you ask. I bet they totally made those ring-dinger videos you see all over YouTube Shorts. Through this marriage, she took the LaLaurie name, and the infamous mansion at 1140 Royal Street became their home. And this home was a grand house, designed in the neoclassical style with wide balconies and tall windows, impressive and imposing, just like Delphine herself. But soon, the mansion would become famous for reasons far darker than any architectural detail. See, neighbors started to report frequent, loud arguments between Delphine and her husband, and by 1834, Leonard LaLaurie had moved out of the house. This, according to some accounts, sent Delphine into a downward spiral. The loss of her third husband seemed to trigger something deeply disturbing inside of her, perhaps an unraveling of her mental state, or perhaps just an unleashing of what had already been buried beneath the surface. This is where the whispers start. People began to talk about how Delphine treated her slaves. Rumors swirled around the LaLaurie household, stories of brutal treatment and cruelty. But it was only when the fire broke out in 1834 that the truth would be exposed for the world to see. Now, this takes place on April 10th of 1834. As I said, a fire would break out at the LaLaurie mansion. Firefighters arrived to find the house ablaze, but what they uncovered inside was beyond anything they could have imagined. As the fire was put out and the evacuation took place, a horrifying discovery was made in the upper floors of the mansion. 7 enslaved individuals, starved, beaten, and chained. They were found in a condition so grotesque that it defies description. Some accounts say their bodies were deformed from years of this. Others tell of enslaved people who had broken bones that had never been treated. And then there are more horrific, though unverified reports. Some people were allegedly covered in honey, for instance, which attracts swarms of ants, and others were subjected to experiments, surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. The fire had revealed the truth of Delphine LaLaurie's House of Horrors. But it didn't end there. The woman, who had long been known for her wealth and social stature, was now revealed as a monster. The discovery of torture chambers led to an immediate investigation, and an outraged mob quickly descended on the mansion. Despite the mob's fury and the undeniable evidence of her cruelty, Delphine was never arrested. She had actually already fled, disappearing into the night, and rumors swirled that she had escaped to Mobile, Alabama first before making her way to Paris. Now, the final years of Delphine's life are shrouded in mystery. After fleeing New Orleans, she lived in exile in Paris, where she reportedly passed away in 1888 after a boar hunting accident. Some historians say she lived out her days in obscurity, but there's also something chilling about the idea that even in her final years, Delphine LaLaurie was never fully held accountable for the horrors she inflicted. And with all of this in mind, I think it's time for a quick side note. Despite the controversy that lingers around the LaLaurie case, some of the darkest and most gruesome details of the scandal-ridden story that still plagues the modern mansion, according to many, might not be true. For example, as I stated, the experiments that were supposedly ongoing in the Delphine home may have been made up. The details of what happened in the LaLaurie mansion after that fire, especially the more gruesome aspects, largely came from a single source: the New Orleans Bee, a local newspaper that was famous for its sensationalist approach to reporting. And when I say sensationalist, I mean it was basically the tabloid of the day, like the National Enquirer, but with a slightly more 19th century flair. The Bee loved a good dramatic story, especially one that involved scandal, intrigue, and shock value, and they also had a penchant for mixing facts with fiction, often blurring the lines between reality and pure sensationalism. And if you could believe it, things get more messy. The Bee's reports on the LaLaurie mansion came mostly from Delphine's neighbor, Monsieur Montreuil, who was, well, not exactly impartial. You see, this man had a bit of a history with Madame LaLaurie. He was rumored to have made romantic advances towards her, which she quite famously rejected. A man scorned, perhaps? Some historians believe he might have had a personal vendetta against Delphine, and that his motivation to smear her reputation might have colored the way he described what was happening in that house. After all, what better way to get back at a woman who turned down your advances than to paint her as a deranged monster, right? Honestly, no, not right. Regardless, let's not kid ourselves. Even if the most gruesome stories of this home were a work of fiction, the truth remains that Delphine was responsible for the mistreatment of her slaves, and no embellishment is necessary to make a monster out of her in that regard. And finally, that brings us to what you're here for, these spooky ghosts. See, LaLaurie Mansion's dark history didn't end with Delphine's departure. In fact, it's the kind of place that just won't let go. Over the years, reports of paranormal activity have come from anyone brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to approach the mansion, and there are many legends and even more ghost stories. To start, it's worth noting even before Delphine lived here, strange things had been reported. One legend tells of a man who passed away on the property during a supposed robbery, although nothing was missing and no culprit was ever found. It's said that the man that got supposedly robbed before his passing warned his friend that a demon was living in the LaLaurie mansion, and it was ready to take the man's life. Now, whether that's a spooky tale, we don't really know, but it sets the stage for the horrors to come. Moving on to the years after the LaLaurie fire, the mansion saw a new life as a girls' school, and many of the children who attended reported feeling the presence of something dark, something angry. Some even claimed that they were physically grabbed and scratched by an unseen force. When they were asked who was doing it, their answer was often chilling. They said, "That woman, of course," referring to Madame LaLaurie. And then there are ghosts, lots of them. People who have ventured near the house claim to feel strange sensations, like being watched or followed. The building itself, because of this, is said to emit an oppressive, maybe even heavy feeling. There are also frequent reports of phantom footsteps, moaning, and sounds of chains dragging across the floor. possibly echoes from the supposedly tortured souls who were chained and imprisoned in the upper floors. Folks also claim to see ghostly silhouettes frequently darting past the upstairs windows, and sometimes they're caught staring out of them at New Orleans' modern-day patrons. One of the most poignant stories comes from mediums who claim to have contacted the spirit of a young girl named Leah, who allegedly passed away after falling from a window while trying to escape from Madame LaLaurie's cruelty. They say she lingers in the house, trapped in the same cycle of horror she experienced in life. Admittedly, there is also some controversy over whether LaLaurie caused her to pass, but that's just that, unverifiable controversy. And most today blame Delphine for her passing. Other spirits reportedly include a prankster ghost, a young boy who likes to mess with anyone trying to communicate with the dead. He asks strange questions and pulls pranks as if mocking the seriousness of the tragedies that took place within the mansion walls. And let's not forget the pocket tuggers, the ghosts that apparently are said to steal from people. Visitors to the mansion have reported feeling as if their pockets are being pulled or their wallets are being taken. But when they turn around to confront the culprit, nobody's there. Anyways, even ignoring the ghosts that now dwell here, Madame LaLaurie's story is one of cruelty. She represents the darker side of human nature, the side that uses power and privilege to control and destroy. Her mansion, though physically standing, has become a symbol of that evil. The ghost stories, the rumors, the chilling history, all of these have ensured that the LaLaurie mansion remains one of the most haunted places in New Orleans, if not the entire United States. So in short, the LaLaurie mansion isn't just haunted by spirits. It's haunted by the legacy of a woman whose actions continue to echo through time. That is, if you believe the stories, of course. Alright, buckle up because I'm about to take you on a wild, mystical ride through the life of one of the most iconic women to ever walk the streets of New Orleans. The one, the only Muriel Laveau. You've probably heard of her, right? Or at least heard whispers, rumors, and spooky tales about her. Or maybe you've just watched her role in American Horror Story. Either way, let me tell you this. This woman, this legend, is a whole lot more than the ghost stories and folklore floating around the French Quarter. Let me break it down for you. Marie was born on September 10th of 1801 in New Orleans. Muriel Laveau came into this world when the city was still a Spanish colony. But in the grand scheme of things, this was the kind of place where cultures collided: French, Spanish, African, and Native American. Marie's mother, a free woman of African, European, and Native American descent, was part of that rich mix. But here's the kicker. Her father, well, he's a little bit of a mystery. Now, some say it was Charles Laveau, a white Louisiana Creole politician. Others claim that it was a local man who got involved with her mother. In any case, Marie's name came from her mother's side, and she had no father listed on her baptismal record. Still, it didn't seem to matter much because young Marie was destined for greatness. Fast forward a bit, by 1819 our girl Marie had married Jacques Paris, a free man of color who had made his way to New Orleans from the turbulent Haitian Revolution. They had a couple of kids, but sadly life didn't cut them much slack. Their daughters didn't make it past childhood, and Jacques disappeared from the records in 1822. The mysterious vanishing of her husband has fueled plenty of gossip over the years. Some folks think he ran off, others suggest something more nefarious, but most believe he just died, probably in Baton Rouge, because in an 1824 baptismal certificate, Marie was referred to as the Widow Paris, so mystery solved, I guess. After Jacques was gone, Marie hooked up with a new man, Christophe Dominique Duminy de Glapion, a French-descended nobleman. She stuck it out with Christophe for the long haul, 33 years to be precise. Together they had a whopping 15 children. So in addition to all of the things I'm about to tell you, she was also a mother to many, many kids. Now let's talk about what made Marie Marie. She wasn't just the wife of a nobleman and a mom to 15 kids, as if that wasn't impressive enough. No, she was a businesswoman, a healer, an herbalist, and a voodoo practitioner, which is what you probably know her for. Her magical career didn't start out of nowhere either. Her family had some roots in African spirituality, and after her mother passed away, Marie got serious about it. She trained under a Senegalese conjurer named John Bayou, and from there, her reputation began to soar. Marie wasn't just a voodoo priestess, she became a full-on celebrity in the occult world. She ran a beauty parlor in New Orleans, because of course she did, where she'd chat with wealthy ladies and gents, subtly gleaning juicy gossip. She'd also sell them them charms, potions, and the occasional magical tidbit to get their wishes fulfilled. Who doesn't love a good hairdo with a side of advice on how to win at life, right? But it wasn't just all tea and charm bracelets. Marie was also an advisor to the high and mighty in New Orleans, the rich and the powerful. Even lawmakers and business leaders would seek her out for guidance. Need help with a decision? Marie was your woman. And just between us, I wouldn't be surprised if her clairvoyance, she touted, was enhanced by all of that inside information she picked up while doing hair. It's a good business strategy, no doubt about it. And now time to get into some of the lore. I know this part is going to make your eyebrows raise, but bear with me. According to one legend, Marie had a pet snake named Zombie. Yep, you heard that right. Zombie wasn't just for kicks, though. This snake was part of her spiritual practice. Legend has it that the snake was a conduit to an African god also named Zombie, and whenever the snake hissed, it was the god speaking directly through it. Talk about an assistant. Other stories say that Marie was an adept potion maker, and some say she had a secret recipe book of herbs and potions that could heal ailments, fix relationships, and even help you get your revenge on a rival. You know, casual stuff like that. People swore by her potions, but honestly, who knows how much was actually magical and how much was just solid advice masked in mystery. And let's not forget the folklore around Marie's visits to death row inmates. Supposedly, she would meet with prisoners facing execution, either to pray with them, prepare their last meal, or perhaps slip them something to ease their passage, perhaps related to those potions I mentioned earlier. Some versions of the story even have her secretly giving poisons to the condemned so that they could go peacefully instead. But here's the thing, most folks close to her say that she was just there to offer comfort, to help them find peace in their final moments, and maybe to try to get them a pardon if she could. But hey, where there's mystery, there's room for a little drama, right? Regardless of what the truth was about Marie, she passed away on June 15th of 1881 at the ripe old age of 79. And let me tell you, New Orleans showed up for her funeral. It was a huge event, attended by people from all walks of life, from voodoo practitioners to members of the white elite. But here's where it gets even juicier. Her death didn't mean the end of her legend. People still claimed to see her ghost around New Orleans, especially near St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, where she's believed to be buried. But the real kicker is her grave. It's become a spot, not just for history buffs, but for anyone who believes that if you mark an X on her tombstone, your wish might just come true. And if you happen to be touring St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, the only way you can see it these days, you might just see some X's with circles around them. That, they say, is a sign that a wish someone made was actually granted. All of this being said, if you ever go visit, please don't write on her grave. Don't be that person, just show some respect. So there you have it, Marie Laveau, the original New Orleans queen who blended beauty, business, and spirituality into one unforgettable life. Her legacy lives on, not just in the folklore surrounding her, but in the very fabric of New Orleans itself. Her voodoo magic may not have been 100% substantiated, but it doesn't matter because the legend of Marie Laveau is as alive as ever. You've probably heard of the chupacabra, right? The blood-sucking creature of legend that roams the wilds of Latin America, and I guess some of North America, often described as a creepy mix of reptile and canid. But what if I told you New Orleans had its own version? A terrifying creature that seems to have one-upped the chupacabra in sheer weirdness. Let's chat about the Grunch. Part chupacabra, part something straight out of your worst nightmares, the Grunch is often described as a creature that's somewhere between a dog and a reptile, with sharp spines, glowing eyes, and enough strangeness to leave even the bravest locals thinking twice about what lurks in the shadows. But here's where it gets weird. While it shares some characteristics with the chupacabra, the Grunch's origin story is much older, steeped in New Orleans folklore, and tied to one of the city's most famous figures, Marie Laveau, the legendary voodoo queen we just talked about. If you can't already tell, this isn't just one of your run-of-the-mill monster stories. No, the Grunch's origins go way back to the early days of New Orleans, when Marie Laveau was in her prime. In the heart of voodoo lore, there's a chilling tale of a devil baby, supposedly the spawn of Satan himself. The story goes that Marie Laveau, in her mercy, took in this deformed child instead of casting it aside, as some might expect. But don't be fooled, she didn't do it out of kindness. She had a very specific reason. Laveau, ever the pragmatist, didn't want this devilish creature to spread its evil, so she took matters into her own hands, quite literally. In a bizarre and gruesome move, she castrated the devil baby, thinking this would prevent it from reproducing, and in turn spreading the wickedness it embodied. But in a twist that could only come from a voodoo queen's worst nightmare, the baby's testes, yes, his little boys, hit the ground and turned into two grunches, a male and a female, that immediately attacked Marie. These weren't trivial monsters. The Grunches, little chupacabras, bit and punched at Marie with such fury that she almost succumbed to their assault. At the brink of unconsciousness, Marie finally fainted, and when she woke up, the Grunches and the devil baby had disappeared. Poof, gone. And after this terrifying incident, some say Marie Laveau had turned her back on voodoo, returning to Catholicism in fear of the evil she had just encountered. Talk about a bad day at the office. Now, you might think this is where the story ends, but no, the Grunch didn't just slink back into obscurity. This creature is still said to haunt New Orleans to this day. And where do they live? Well, there's a road in the eastern part of the city known as Grunch Road. And because they're so often seen near this old disheveled road, they have taken its name as their own. This road is, at least nowadays, a dead-end path, nestled in a secluded area near little woods, surrounded by water oaks and sand. It's the kind of place where strange creatures could easily stay hidden. According to locals, the Grunch aren't just lurking in the woods, they're doing some pretty disturbing stuff. They've been known to eat house pets, rummage through garbage cans, and even dash across Highway 90 sometimes in the dead of night. If you're driving there, you might just spot one of these glowing-eyed monsters darting across the road, it's said. Also, things get even spookier. After Hurricane Katrina flooded New Orleans, many people reported seeing an increase in Grunch sightings. Most lore says this is because they were driven out of their hiding spots by floodwaters, or were they simply taking advantage of the chaos to wander freely? Either way, the post-Katrina period saw a spike in Grunch encounters. Perhaps these creatures had been living in the shadows all along, only to be flushed out by the destruction caused by the storm. This phenomenon wasn't just confined to the aftermath of the hurricane and the odd reefer-fueled Tuesday night either. The Grunch has a history of unsettling encounters stretching all the way back to the Civil War. Confederate soldiers stationed near these swamps allegedly encountered a horned demon, later believed to be a Grunch. In the story, these soldiers fought off the creature, with two men reportedly taken down by the beast before it fled into the swamp. This creature, often called the Chalmette Devil when this tale is recounted, further fueled rumors of a monstrous being lurking in the bayous around New Orleans. Beyond these tales, there's also another account I find sort of hilarious. In the early 1900s, a streetcar driver named Elmer Castine had an unforgettable encounter with what he described as a huge, hairy beast. The creature allegedly jumped onto the streetcar and attacked him while it was on a less trafficked part of the tracks. Elmer was lucky to survive the encounter, and the story of the attack reignited public interest in the Grunch legend. Now, with all of these stories in mind, let's ask the question, where's the Grunch today? Well, if you buy the stories, these creatures are still very much alive and well, and they're most commonly blamed for feeding on house pets, as I said, rummaging through the trash, and being seen as shadowy black blurs running across the highway in the dead of night. There are also the odd reports of glowing eyes peering out of the dark and eerie sounds of howling or screeching in the distance when individuals wander near Grunch Road. Anyways, whether you believe in the Grunch or not, one thing is clear. New Orleans has a way of making even the most unsettling stories feel like it's part of its rich, strange history. So the next time you find yourself in New Orleans, don't just watch out for the ghosts of the past. Keep an eye out for something much, much stranger that exists in the present too. The Grunch may still be watching. Pirates, politicians, war heroes, and a ragtag band of misfits taking on the British Empire. That's right, baby, we're talking about the 1814 Battle of New Orleans. And in particular, we're going to talk about Jean Lafitte's role in it. Pull up a chair for this one. Also, a quick interjection. I know I have British viewers, I love you guys, but this story is one that puts Americans at odds with the British, and it doesn't necessarily express my personal views in the slightest. Trust me, I love you guys. So here's the setup. It's the War of 1812, which despite the name actually lasted from, you guessed it, 1812 to 1815. That's a common joke in America. When does the War of 1812 start? Anyways, the United States, young and feisty, was ticked off at Britain for treating them like the annoying younger sibling sibling they didn't want to share their toys with, or I guess perhaps the high seas with. The Brits were impressing, or literally kidnapping US soldiers off of US ships and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. And they were also stirring up trouble with the Native American tribes on the frontier, screwing with American trade via blockades. Americans, of course, said, "Cut this out, I've had enough," and they would declare war in June of 1812. Admittedly, throwing down against the world's greatest superpower wouldn't be a painless task. A few fights were lost, and Washington, D.C. and the White House even got burnt to a crisp in the process. Definitely a low point. Meanwhile, though, if we wander down south to that large chunk of land the U.S. just bought from Napoleon in 1803, you'd find the city of New Orleans, sitting at the mouth of the Mississippi. And while today we don't think much of this, New Orleans was a huge deal, and really still is. Control New Orleans, and you control the trade up and down the Mississippi. The British, of course, they knew this, and they wanted it bad. But luckily, in comes Andrew Jackson, the general you probably know well that was tough as nails with a hatred for two things, Brits and bureaucracy. The dude was part soldier, part wild bear as far as I'm concerned. Anyways, Jackson would hear a massive British fleet was sailing for New Orleans to block access to the Mississippi. And there was a bit of a problem. See, Jackson didn't really have an army, at least not one that resembled any more than a militia. However, Jackson did have grit and a flair for improvisation, and also he had a wild card named John Lafitte. John Lafitte was a French privateer, see, pirate with paperwork, based out of Barataria Bay, south of New Orleans. I've been reading a lot about John, and personally, I picture some mix between Jack Sparrow and Napoleon Bonaparte, but with better hair than either and a soft spot for Creole culture. And being a privateer, he was essentially allowed to be a pirate without repercussions, so long as it didn't negatively impact the US government. Jean and his brother Pierre operated in the area, running a smuggling empire, bringing in goods and slaves and selling them through illicit channels. And here's where things get juicy. In late 1814, the Brits would show up at Barataria and make Lafitte the offer that if he helped them take New Orleans, they'd make him a rich British officer. Jean apparently smiled and thanked them, and then sent their proposal to the governor of Louisiana. See, despite being a pirate, Lafitte loved New Orleans, and he wasn't about to hand it over to some of these powdered wig-wearing redcoats. Thus, shortly after sending this notice to the governor, he'd go to General Jackson and be like, "Hey bro, I've got cannons, ships, gunpowder, meat, and a grudge against the British. You in?" Funny enough, at first, Jackson wasn't in, but after realizing how screwed the Americans were otherwise, he took that police badge off and said, "F it, we ball." And let me tell you what, Lafitte pulled through. He provided 300 Baratarians, men who were largely naval veterans, crack shots, and they knew how to fire artillery like nobody's business. In contrast, all Jackson could muster up were some free black soldiers, Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen, and some Native American warriors. Not bad at all, but not exactly what you want for a heated naval battle. Anyways, all of these misfits from separate backgrounds would come together like the 1814 version of the Avengers, just with more facial hair and worse dental hygiene. Now comes the battle. It was January 8th of 1815. The Brits had 8,000 troops, veterans. The Americans had 4,000 at most, but were fortified along a narrow slip between the Mississippi and a swamp. And not to be gross, the Americans and pirates mowed the British down. The British lost over 2,000, while the American forces barely lost 70. It was rough. The British definitely sailed home with the music off after that one. And the worst part about this, the war was already over, as the Treaty of Ghent had been signed in Europe in December of 1814, but the word just hadn't reached New Orleans yet. In other words, this battle hardly mattered, if not for two things. Andrew Jackson was elevated to the status of national hero, pretty much propelling him to his presidency, and John Lafitte got his pardon. And exactly what happened to him was never really known. Anyways, while John Lafitte was no saint, far from it, he chose to fight for a city he loved, and in doing so, helped change the course of history. Though, as we discussed, not the course of America. Anyways, next time someone says pirates never did anything good, tell them about old Jean Lafitte, and the time a bunch of smugglers helped save New Orleans. So, look, I'm not trying to ruin your vacation or anything, but if you're wandering around the French Quarter thinking, ooh la la, baguettes and berets, I gotta stop you right there, because buddy, the French Quarter is largely Spanish. Yeah, let that sink in for a second. Here's what happened. New Orleans was founded by the French, sure, but in classic colonial chaos fashion, France handed Louisiana over to Spain in 1763, like it was an old couch they didn't want anymore. You take it, it's got some issues, but the vibes are great. Now, during the 4 decades that Spain ruled New Orleans, the city did what it does best. It caught fire. A lot. 2 huge fires, one in 1788 and another in 1794, basically torched the whole place. Almost every building that looked oh so French was reduced to ashes, including 80% of the quarter during the first blaze alone. And of course, who rebuilt it? The Spanish. But here's the kicker, they didn't rebuild it to look French again. Nope, they rebuilt it Spanish style, using their own building codes, which luckily focused heavily on fire safety. No more charming wooden buildings with flammable pitched roofs. Instead, they slapped on stucco walls, arched doorways, brick exteriors, flat clay tile roofs, and stuck all the buildings close together near the street. Fire risk reduced. Aesthetic, very Iberian. You know those iconic courtyards and those dreamy wrought iron balconies everyone Instagrams to death? Those are Spanish. The pastel colors, the ironwork, the elegant arched windows, also Spanish. Even the Cabildo and the Presbytere, those buildings that sandwich the St. Louis Cathedral in Jackson Square, they were built under Spanish rule. The Cabildo was literally Spain's headquarters in Louisiana, and the place where the Louisiana Purchase was signed in 1803. If the French Quarter had a Spanish flagpole, it would be planted right there. Only about 1% of the buildings in the quarter are actually French from the colonial area. Want to see them? It's basically the old Ursuline Convent from 1752 and Lafitte's Blacksmith shop. That's pretty much it. And as we said earlier, Lafitte's Blacksmith shop is candlelit, so who knows how long that'll be around. But here's where things get wild. People never really stopped being French. Even under Spanish rule, they were like, cool, we'll follow your fire codes, but we're still going to speak French, eat butter-drenched everything, and marry our cousins. And also we're going to party through Lent. You know, French stuff. Even the butchers at the public market, the Spanish built, kept calling it the French market. That's some serious cultural branding. And today, the quarter still clings to that French identity, even though the buildings are singing flamenco behind their French facades. Oh, and if you ever need any more proof of Spain's sneaky legacy, New Orleans now hosts its own running of the bulls. Except, instead of actual bulls, it's just women on roller skates with toy bats chasing you through the streets. You know, local flavor. So yeah, culturally French, architecturally Spanish. The French Quarter is like a croissant made in a tapas bar. Beautiful, delicious, confusing, but somehow it works. And now that you know, welcome to the Spanish Quarter that everyone still calls French, trademarked. Folks, thank you all for joining me on this journey through the city which, in my personal opinion, may very well have the best food in North America. From beignets to gumbo. Man, I'm getting hungry about now. Also, hey, if you liked it, your sub, a like, and a comment would mean an awful lot to me. Also, you know I give updates at the end of these videos, so while I'm happy to declare next week we'll be taking a closer look at Mississippi, I also wanted to announce that I'm planning something a little bit new. How do we feel about proper ghost tours guided by yours truly? I have one in the works and I'll keep you updated on its progress, but I'm hoping it's going to be on Franklin, Tennessee's ghosts. We'll see when I get to it. I think I should get to it in the next few months. Anyways, enough of that. Whether you're in New Orleans walking down the street and you just saw the shutters on the Ursuline Convent open a little bit, or if your home's axe went missing and suddenly you can't find any of your jazz albums, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.